Hey everyone, welcome back to another devlog. It's been a while. I think the last one we did was, when was it? Back in July or something? June? I don't even remember. I'm joined by three wonderful people. Rich, hello. Simon, hello. Dominic, hey. It's my first time meeting Dominic online, so that's nice. Hi.
Hey.
Simon and Rich, I've talked to you a bunch before, so I'm just going to give you the regular hi. So we're here today to talk a bit about runes and what you folks have been working on. I think, when was runes released again, or the preview? Sorry, was it last month? 2 months ago?
September 20th, I
Time
think.
flies.
Yes, September 20th.
Oh, so
The
pretty much a month
the
ago.
date is seared into our minds because that was a frantic week.
For all three of you, I guess. I'm working
Hmm.
very hard
For
to
the
get
entire
it.
team, yeah, not just the three of us, the whole team really pulled together to make that happen, which is exciting. I kind of love having those artificial deadlines. Um, I mean, maybe not artificial. The last big one, I guess, was the Svelte kit one release, and before that, the Svelte kit release candidate at last
Yep.
year's in-person Svelte Summit. Like at those times, the whole team just rallies and like we pull out all the stops, and it's the most fun that we have working on Svelte, I think.
Yeah. I guess maybe we could start with, for those that aren't aware or haven't like seen the news about runes. What are runes? What, how do we explain them?
Uh, all right, so Simon, Dominic, jump in and correct me if I go off script here. Not that we have a script. Runes are essentially the way that we declare reactivity in Svelte 5 and beyond. With the caveat that the Svelte 4 approach is continuing to work, everything is going to be backwards compatible, etc. We're going to introduce this new way of saying this thing over here is a reactive piece of state. This thing over here is derived from these other reactive pieces of state. And this thing down here is some code that is going to run in response to those pieces of state and derived state changing, and we call those effects. So these three concepts, state, derivations, and effects, pretty familiar to people who have used most frameworks. We have versions of this in Svelte today. You know, let foo equals 1. That is state if you later reassign that value. And if you have the $: syntax, that can be either a derivation or an effect in today's world. But beyond Svelte, like every framework has some notion of these concepts. React has use state and use memo and use effect. And in the world of signal-based frameworks like Solid, these words keep appearing again and again. And so in Svelte 5, we are essentially taking those concepts and bringing them into the language itself. And the way that you use them is kind of like using a function, except that they're not functions. They are magic symbols. They're magic symbols that tell the compiler that your code is supposed to behave in a certain way. And we were casting around for like what should we call these things? Like, what is a good name for a magic symbol? I have been playing a lot of a game on the. I don't know if anyone else has got one of these. The Quest 2. There's a game on there called Ragnarok. It's like a rhythm game, a Viking-themed rhythm game where your job is to smash the runes as they're coming towards you. And it's like, oh, runes! Runes are magic symbols. Let's call it that. So that is what runes are. They are magic symbols that inject behaviors into your code. They tell the compiler how to do things a certain way. And because it's not like a function that you import, it's actually a part of the language, the compiler can do some really interesting optimizations around that so that we get all of the flexibility of signal-based solutions, but with the developer experience that people are used to from Svelte.
Yeah, nothing to add there.
All right. I guess that's a nice recap. And
although I guess if someone is like, okay, all right, I hear all that, but what are they? It's probably worth reading the introductory blog post. We'll have to dig the link up from somewhere because that gives concrete examples of what these actually look like and how you use them in practice.
Yeah, we also have a dedicated Svelte 5 preview site with a playground where you can try it out today, and like some preliminary docs where we explain the different runes in detail, and also have some comparisons like old versus new syntax, how they compare, and where you can also see that it isn't that much different on second look.
Yeah, I know that's we mentioned it before we started here, that a lot of the feedback has been, it doesn't look like it used to. Well, what is this? So how's the feedback been, like, from you guys' perspective?
I mean, for me, I was pleasantly surprised by the feedback. Whenever you change something, it's tough for people who have invested time into learning a particular way of doing things, and you're basically saying, no more of that. We're going to do this whole other thing. And that's hard for people. And so we were definitely braced for like a lot of negative feedback. And there was some negative feedback, but on the whole, the reaction was much more positive than I expected. And the negative feedback that we had, a lot of it was fairly reasonable. It was pertaining to things that we hadn't explained all that well in the initial round. And so we've sort of gone back and we've refined some of our explanations, and we've gone back to the drawing board on a couple of things. But broadly, pretty positive, I would say. I was at a dev meetup last night, and someone came over to me and said, I'm really excited about runes. Like, I think in general, people who have experienced the things that happen in Svelte 3 and 4 that led us to coming up with this idea, like, people are excited for that. People who haven't yet hit those pain points are a little bit, oh, hang on, I need to do this extra thing now. Like, I don't get it.
Yeah.
But broadly, I think the more hands-on experience someone has with Svelte, the more likely they are to be like, oh yeah, this is the right way.
Absolutely.
It's also very interesting that many of the like outside world, I felt like the reception from the non-Svelte crowd was more positive than from the Svelte crowd, which kind of makes sense, because if you chose Svelte and really like it, then you've also come accustomed to its pain points, or maybe you just haven't experienced them because like the type of apps you build, you don't run into them as often. But like on the outside, like React community or the Vue community, those were even more enthusiastic, like, oh yeah, I can definitely see myself jumping into Svelte now, which is I think a nice win there, that we can also like attract people that were currently hesitant to try out Svelte, which feel more confident trying it out now.
And I think as well, the REPL really helped here, because people could actually play with the code. It was one thing looking at some new API designs and something that may be scary at first, but actually playing around with it and smiling because it works the way you think it should, and it feels, intuitive, then, that really does help the case a lot. And I think definitely from my perspective, seeing people's opinions change after a few days or a week after trying it and seeing what other people have done, that really was encouraging, that, maybe we have got something here it's worthwhile pursuing.
But also, it's not just people seeing it work, it's also people seeing it not work. There have been a number of cases where people have found bugs or things that we just hadn't got around to doing yet in the REPL, and they've been able to give us that feedback, and that has made the framework more robust. So having a playground, I've always maintained, is the most important thing whenever you're creating something, like any kind of developer tooling that people write code and it does something. Like, have an online playground, and then you will get the best feedback possible, and that's been true this time as well.
Yeah, and also the Discord channel, I skim the Svelte Runes channel from time to time, and as Rich points out, sometimes people are like, hey, this thing doesn't work as expected, why? And most of the time it's a bug, and I'm like, okay, let's look into this and fix it. But also on the to what Dominic said with turning around people's minds there, I remember, I don't know the nickname, but there was one person, I think, which was very opposed to runes right when it came out, and like 1 week later, someone else came in and also was against it, and that same person was by then convinced of runes and explained the benefits, which was really encouraging to see.
I just know my experience of using Svelte over the years. So I've basically I started using Svelte in version 3, right? And I went from just a basic usage type. I rarely touched the reactive statements, etc. Maybe just for some basic stuff. And then I remember I started using them a lot, and I ran into a lot of issues, figuring out like which one is running first, etc. The order of execution and all of this stuff. And then, curiously enough, I've gone back to, because of SvelteKit probably, I've gone back to just like not doing a lot of that stuff on the front end. I've just like done as much as I can on the back end, and then I just sprinkle in a few visual things on the front end. So this is interesting for me, because then I can bring in some of that visual stuff back into my code, basically. I don't know if I wonder if that's an experience others have had. Just shying away from the reactive statements.
I definitely do relate to what you describe. When you start using SvelteKit, you find yourself doing like all of your data munging and stuff like that. You're doing that in your load functions, so that the stuff that gets sent into the component in the first place is like already ready to use. It's like it's pre-formatted, so you're not doing a whole lot of $ formatted data equals like data dot map,
exactly.
like whatever. Like you don't need to do as much of that typically. And so yes, I do definitely relate to that. But at the same time, you know, we have seen people, particularly when people are building any kind of library component and things like that, that complexity tends to creep back in. And one of the things that I've observed in my own code, as well as in other people's code, is that when you have this behavior inside components, like you have this sort of magical land where variables are automatically updating, and like everything inside of a : just like magically updates all the time. It's pretty hard to refactor that out into a separate set of functions or into a different module entirely. And so because of that, people tend not to bother. And so those : statements just grow and grow and grow in complexity, and they become these unrefactorable nightmares. And that is one of the key things that we were trying to address with the design of Svelte 5.
Yeah, definitely. I think that like refactoring has become much more easy, doable in the first place with runes, because for once the overhead of doing so is like the barrier for entry, so to speak, is much lower. In the blog post you can see where it's basically like you take the existing logic and you just wrap it around a function, and everything inside stays the same. And if you would have to do that today, you would have to create a store from that logic, and so you would have to do all this like tedious conversion into stores. And it's also a bit like the red pill blue pill problem with async await. Like once you have a store, and then everything else that you want to derive from it, unless it's inside of a component, you also have to make it a store now. And so it's that makes it harder to like extract that out and combine stuff. And with runes, it's much more. It's much easier to extract, to refactor, and it's also much easier to compose several things together, because there's not this subscribe contract which you have to adhere to. You can just like use getters or functions, and it works.
Yeah. So in terms of under the hood, like the stuff that people aren't seeing, or I guess you could see the output by if you click the JS output tab on the preview site, but what are we getting in terms of improvements on under the hood?
So there's really a couple of things that Svelte 4 doesn't get quite right with this. We've talked about the reactivity and the difficulty in getting things to be refactorable and so on. But really there are two big problems with Svelte as it is today. Number one, you have a kind of a performance cliff when you have large lists of things and then you have state changing inside those lists, because in Svelte 4, reactivity is based on very top level variables inside components. So if you have a list with 1,000 items and then one thing changes inside one property of an object inside that list, then the entire list needs to be updated, and that's no good. Other frameworks have solved this with something called fine-grained reactivity using things like signals. The other problem that we've had with Svelte 4 is that the generated code that the compiler produces from your input gets a little bit large. And it's not a huge problem. Like typically you need to have a very, very complicated page before like the payload for a page is larger than it would be with a different framework, because Svelte starts out very small and then it grows at a faster rate than other frameworks, but they start out slightly larger and grow at a smaller rate. And we can fix both of those things with the Svelte 5 output. And this is something that I think Dominic deserves most of the credit for, because the code base that grew into Svelte 5 was the Octane code base prior to that. Octane is a framework that Dominic, I don't know if you want to talk about that and like how you landed on the particular signal approach that you brought to Svelte 5. But both of those problems are essentially solved by this new architecture. And as you say, in the playground, if you flick over to the JS output tab, you can see how much less code is generated by the Svelte 5 compiler than the Svelte 4 compiler, just because a lot of the smarts are now handled by the signals that we're using under the hood, that the thing that is making runes work. It's just a lot less code.
Yeah, maybe I can expand. Actually, so earlier this year, I remember giving a demo to Rich of Octane. Octane was the sort of precursor. It was a sort of React-like compiler-driven, signals-driven sort of framework I was building, mostly as a prototype in my spare time, as to see what's possible. I remember giving a demo to Rich, and I remember the thing that stood out to him was the fact that components were compiled into functions. So that meant like a minifier could come along, just inline those in theory, and you'd get like tremendously smaller code. And then fast forward a few months, I remember seeing a sort of prototype, or just mainly a sort of code example, pseudocode example of what this could look like with Svelte. And it looked very much like what Rich came up with today. Like we had this idea of like dollar dot, effect, and dollar dot like this and that. And that's essentially what it turned into. And it's kind of similar to Solid in some respects. It's kind of different as well. But also it allows us to keep the exact same code for both like rendering on the client and hydrating on the client, which is a big win, something we didn't have before. So it meant if you were hydrating previously in Svelte 4, there's like an alternative code path you'd have to go through. And to normalize them to a single code path means that we ship even less code, especially when you're hydrating. So there's a lot of things we can learn from before and lean on others to take ideas from and bring that together. But generally speaking, there's so many other things too, like along the way, that we also kind of like thought about and tried out and just like, oh, it doesn't work. Next one, I think even runes itself, that was like the 50th sort of iteration we went through before we got there. We tried everything. And it's kind of funny because when you look at like Reddit and Hacker News, and people are like, why didn't they try using this? Or why didn't they try doing that? I'm fairly certain along the way we did. And we could probably find that particular proposal we came up with at some point and like link it, to show that we really did think about that. And we probably built it, or I built it in like an evening, and the next day we tried out and we're like, nah, it doesn't work, So we really did try to account for every single like possible thing that could go wrong with something, and we got quite far. There were some proposals we came up with that were, a week into, we're like, yes, this is it, we found it. And then like, I think Simon would come up with something. We're like, oh, okay then, next one, so it's a good team effort.
Yeah, so Simon was the red team sometimes. Are you familiar with this concept of like the blue team and the red team? Like sometimes you have someone who is assigned to see the flaws, like to poke holes in something to make sure that you're doing the right thing. And Simon is the most gifted red team person I've ever met. Really, really good at seeing the non-obvious things that are going to go wrong with a particular idea. And so there were a couple of times when Dominic and I were like, yes, we fixed it. And Simon would come back and said, but what about this? And I'm not going to lie, like the whole process was at times incredibly frustrating because we really felt that we were like in kind of like a maze, and like every way you turned, you had hit some massive obstacle. And then at other points, we'd have an idea that basically met all of our criteria, but then, you know, as we shared it with more people, people would turn around and say, well, this just doesn't feel like Svelte. And it got to the point where we weren't sure that we would ever be able to come up with a design that satisfied all of our criteria. But I think we basically did it with runes. 50th time's the charm.
Yeah, definitely. It was, yeah. I mean, the overall process, I think it was a bit more than 2 months where we tossed around ideas. And I think the last 4 weeks of those were the most intense ones. And yeah, like we had so many different constraints, which made it like harder to come up with a good design, because not only should it be like consistent and fix the issues we encountered beforehand, but it also should like have the vibes component to it, like that it shouldn't like get away too much or deviate too much from what made Svelte great in the first place. And that like ruled out many of the purely runtime API-based solutions. Like I don't know, if you had to do it like dot value everywhere now, I think that would be too much to ask, for example, for someone using Svelte today. And so we had like very different and hard constraints, and that made it very hard to come up with a good design that like ticked all the boxes. And yeah, so like it's also interesting because again in the runes chat or on Reddit, people were like speed running many of the ideas we had. For example, like, why didn't you use labels for this? Like, we have the $: thing already. Why don't you go all in on labels? And actually, that was one of the first ideas we had, which we explored further. Like, yeah, maybe that's it. But like, it felt too limiting because with labels, you don't have any way to maybe add options to it, because with runes now it's just functions. So if we want to give state or derive or effect a second argument for options later on, it's much like that just isn't doable in a good way with labels. And also it's not TypeScript compatible. So one of the goals was, okay, you should be able to use that same reactivity inside JS and TS files. And we can't just like take over the IntelliSense of those files. And so it had to be valid TypeScript, like type checkable. And so that also ruled out labels. Yeah, and like we investigated comments before it. We investigated, I don't know, going with decorators. Yeah, we had many different ideas.
We investigated creating entirely new languages. You know, a new file extension with a component keyword, and like state count equals 0 instead of like count equals, like all of these things. We went down the rabbit hole on so many different things, and all of them ran aground on some problem or other, and until we realized that we're already abusing syntax in Svelte 4. Like, we abuse the export keyword for props, we abuse let for reactivity, we abuse labels for derive reactivity and effects. So why not abuse function syntax as well? And when we realized that we could do that, and it gives us all of the TypeScript friendliness that we need, because, you know, TypeScript thinks that the $state rune, for example, is actually just the identity function, even though it's not. we get that. We get all of the ability to add options, as Simon said, and you can use functions anywhere inside your JavaScript, whereas a label has to be a statement. You can't use it in an expression. And so for all of those reasons, it turned out to be the ideal thing, but it took us a long time to find it.
Also, it's nice that all the magic of Svelte is now contained within one syntactical concept, whereas before it was like export led meant props, and then this other syntactical concept like the dollar thing meant either derived state or effects. And now it's like basically you can go like, okay, if there's a function that begins with a $sign, then there's very high likelihood that this is a rune and something special to Svelte. And so I think that also helps. And it will also help with like learning Svelte. I think that with runes, Svelte will actually be easier to learn now for newcomers compared to today, where you have these different things where it's feels like, okay, it works, but I don't really know how. And now you have to put like a tiny bit more effort into, okay, these are runes and these are the different things. But once you have these very little, like you basically need only 3 things to get started, like state, derived, effect. And once you have those 3 in your head, that vocabulary, everything else goes from there and makes everything else much easier to reason about.
And another great thing about runes is, and we had feedback like, why don't you just expose effects as like an API that you import? Or why don't you just have this thing called state that you import? Is that because they're magical symbols, we can detect them and actually transform them into different things if we want to. That can be an implementation detail. So we can change them into signals, or we can change them into something else. To the user, it works the exact same way. There's no change in behavior. But we can just optimize things under the hood to make less code, or make it slightly faster, or use less memory. And that can be a moving target. We can continuously improve on that over the future. And so that's a really cool thing there too. And I guess one other thing is like having them as runes rather than implicit means that we can detect when the user might do something like that doesn't look right. You know, you assigned it to const and you're trying to mutate it. We can say, hey, that doesn't look right. You know, you probably didn't mean to do that. And we can actually link to documentation or guide them in a system to help them move faster and make an application less buggy, and etc. When you have lots of implicitness there, we have to err on the side of maybe you did mean that, and maybe that is something that's not meant to be reactive. You know, it gets difficult, and that's where most bugs actually occur. If you think about like TypeScript, when you try and do something that's not really TypeScripty, but it works, and then you ship it, and then you forget about it, and then 6 months later you come to it, and you're like, oh no, why is it doing that for? You know, that's kind of what implicitness does here too.
Yeah, I think there's an analogy with the unused CSS removal. You can add code and then like forget what the code was there originally for. And if you're writing regular old CSS, like you're terrified of deleting anything because there's no guarantee that it doesn't apply to something on your page. But when it's scoped to the component and the compiler can say, oh, hey, you're not using this selector anymore. Like, do you just want to get rid of it? You can delete it safely. And the compiler can start to give that same sort of feedback on the reactivity code that you're writing. A really good concrete example of the thing Dominic was talking about, like it's an implementation detail and we could compile it to signals or we could compile it to not signals, is when we target server-side rendering. In SSR mode, like we don't want reactivity because you just generate some HTML and it's completely stateless and then like you're on to the next thing. There's no point in that case creating a signal wrapper around your state in order to then like extract the state in order to render it. Like just have the value, just pass it directly. And we can do that because we don't have these imported signal wrappers. We don't have a runtime API. It's all just done through these compiler hints.
Yeah, oh, sorry. Bad timing there. I feel like a lot of people don't realize that runes are, as you say, like magic keywords or just symbols to tell the compiler to do something. I see often in the runes channel that they're like, because they look like functions, right? It's probably why. So I wonder if we maybe need to push on that some more in like educational material in general.
Maybe the VS Code plugin needs to highlight the runes like with like a little sparkly effect or something,
Oh,
so they
I'd
look
be
magic.
down. I'd be down.
Yeah.
I had the idea as well. I think I mentioned it in one of the channels, like the highlighting dependent variables in the effect statement. But I know there was some issue with doing that because you can find all of the dependencies or something along those lines. Don't remember. But you can do all sorts of fun stuff. Speaking of dev tools, like is there some work being done on that front with regards to runes? Maybe it's not. Oh, maybe it's not time to reveal anything yet. I don't know.
I mean, the work happens in the open, so I don't think it's a secret for those who are interested in it. Yeah, actually, one of our maintainers is like picking up the DevTools extension. Like it gathered dust for a long time, but yeah, he's now dusting it off and yeah, bringing it up to the latest version of Svelte 4. There were some things I think related to the Chrome extension thing where things needed to be adjusted, and just overall, re-implement many of those things. And so, yeah, the DevTools are actually under active development again. It's not necessarily related to runes yet, so I guess that we will see a DevTools extension for Svelte 4. But yeah, when Svelte 5 is out, there will definitely be work to then also bring it into DevTools so that we have, I don't know, specific tooling around that, maybe seeing the dependency graph at runtime, stuff like that.
Okay. So there's been some talk about a special. I'm just like reading the chat here, and there's a question somewhere in here about a special .svelte.js kind of thing. What's that about?
Yeah. So initially, when we unveiled this stuff, we said that the idea was that you would be able to use the same code in .svelte and .js/.ts files. And as far as the Svelte compiler is concerned, that's true. Like you can either call the compile function to compile your .svelte file, or the compile module function to compile your .js or .ts file. But having reflected on it a little bit, we think that it's probably more sensible if we only compile code in .svelte.js files and .svelte.ts files. If we compile everything in every .js or .ts file, then there's the danger of like false positives, essentially. If someone happens to be using a global variable called $state in their non-Svelte code, then that could kind of get in the way of stuff. And it's potentially going to limit our freedom of movement in future. So for the sake of making it really explicit what we're doing, we think we're going to restrict the like what code gets passed through the compiler to files that have a .svelte or a .svelte.js or a .svelte.ts extension. And because we're doing that, we can actually start to do some slightly clever things that can like optimize your code and make it faster. Dominic's been doing some experiments with replacing accessors with classes and things to like bypass some of the limitations of V8, which is pretty fun. And because we've kind of carved out this space, like we can do that sort of experimentation in a way that's a little bit difficult if we're going to say we're going to apply the compiler to literally everything in your code base. It's also going to make things faster.
Fair enough. I guess it's also, yeah, it sounds hard to compile everything. Get it working.
I mean, it's not that so much. I mean, you can easily tell if a file contains any runes. If it like literally doesn't contain the $state or $derived or $effect, like just ignore it. And if it does, then you compile that file. And if it turns out that that string only appeared inside a comment, then again, you ignore it. So I don't think it would be difficult so much. It's more that there's a danger of confusion. Like what world are we in? Are we in the JavaScript world, or are we in the world where we have this ability to have reactivity inside the language? And having it a little bit more explicit is probably just going to make it there's going to be fewer people that end up like getting twisted up about what's happening. It also allows me personally to be a little bit less of a hypocrite, because I have in the past railed against frameworks that have non-standard semantics inside .js files. So like, you know, in Remix you have these, and I think next, prior to the app router, you have these functions that get tree shaken away in some situations, except the tree shaking doesn't really work like that. It's kind of non-standard idea of tree shaking. And then, you know, in Quick we have these dollar functions that get like code split out, and like you can't just move code idiomatically because that doesn't adhere to the compiler's rules. And I've always kind of said, well, these shouldn't be a .js or a .js extension. This should be this whole other thing. And then I completely went back on that a month or so ago and said, why not just like start adding just like random Svelte stuff to the language, and this way we get away without doing that.
Yeah, Rich has this great tendency to not be too stubborn on, like, too caught up with his past opinions. So if there's something where he's adamantly against, there's a chance he is for it 1 year later or something, which I think is a great trait to have, because like what's the saying? The same man never steps into the same river twice, because it's not the same man and not the same river, or something like that.
Heraclitus, yeah. I don't trust any programmer who doesn't think that their 6 month ago self was completely wrong about everything.
I can't even trust myself a week ago.
Actually, one of the great things about rewriting this project almost from scratch is that we've been able to go through all the existing code and tests, and we're like, why did we do that? What were we thinking when we made that decision, you know? And so like, it's great to go back and go, oh, we can actually clean this up, we can tackle things, we can track some things that we really want to improve. And as we bring over the existing behavior, we can obviously align that, but also we can, you know, have steps to improve it too.
Yeah. Speaking of tests, there's a tests page on the preview site where you can see how many tests are passing and not passing, I suppose. How's the work coming along? Are we getting close to release?
I think that the tests, getting all tests passing is only one step. It's not the final step, I think, because there's more to do after that. Like, we need to integrate the whole thing with SvelteKit. We need to ensure that language tools understand runes. ESLint, the Prettier plugin, like, there's many things downstream which we also need to take care of. We also want to make sure that we have a like migration script where you can, like, maybe I imagined it being either that you in the VS Code extension go right click, transform to runes, and it just like does it in your editor for that file, or you run a script where it does that for all files in a project, automatically migrating it as much as possible to runes, because in many cases it's a like very technical generic migration which can be automated, and so yeah, there's many of these things down the line. Yeah, the tests are only the first step, but yeah, it's going along great. So like, I don't know, I think last week we made progress on, I think, 200 or more tests or something that are now passing. So yeah, it's nice. It's also nice for a change, because like previously it was like getting the API right, writing all the documentation, answering questions around the launch, etc. And now it's like, okay, things have settled down a bit, and like you can just like focus on getting tests passing, which is like a relief to the brain, in that you don't have to think about API design as much, and it's more about, okay, I want to get this test passing.
We've also got to completely overhaul all of the docs and learn.svelte.dev, which is going to be a significant undertaking.
You're muted.
Thank you. You kind of just take it for granted, the learn.svelte site and the documentation. It's so good. And of course, it has to be ready.
Yeah, I mean, hopefully a lot of it isn't going to change too much. In the ideal world, we're mostly deleting stuff because there's fewer concepts to learn. And I think that will also potentially be more true post 5.0. Like, we have a whole stack of ideas of things that we want to tackle once this foundation is laid. So I'm not too worried that the documentation is going to like delay the release by months. But documentation is always more time consuming than you anticipate it being. So we've got to factor that in somewhere.
Yeah, maybe there will be some kind of release candidate while the documentation is being worked on, like with maybe.
Yeah,
I don't know.
Maybe.
Just my hoping my wishes are coming true here. What about other kind of like rune primitives? What would you call them? Are there I think like, are you thinking about other runes that you could bring into Svelte at some point? Maybe that's way off though.
So we're certainly not ruling it out. Like, the nice thing about this design is we can add new runes at any time, and they can change the behavior of your code in all sorts of weird and wonderful ways. For now, we've been focusing on these very core primitives, the state, derivations, and effects, and also props. Like, you need to have a way of getting stuff into your component. And by just having these and not having a lot of other stuff that kind of changes the way that you interact with them, has meant that we get to see how people use these things organically, because we don't have all of the answers about what it's going to look like to build complex logic and compose it in various ways. We've just been focusing on having these base layer primitives. But one of the things that people have called out is that in some situations, like I want to have an object that is deeply reactive. Like, all of the properties inside this object should be reactive state in their own right. And when you're constructing your own objects, you don't want to have to write the get and set syntax in your object literals all the time. Like, maybe we have some way of making that a little bit easier. So we're exploring some of the ideas around that, and whether we'll do that or not, whether that'll be part of the 5.0 release, is at this point unclear. But yeah, there's potentially a whole world of runes that we could introduce in subsequent releases.
Yeah, exciting. Because we've seen, like, in the runes channel, that people have been experimenting with doing just such a thing, right? But that's I think functions. So maybe if it was brought in the core of Svelte 5, it would be a rune that would get compiled away, and it wouldn't be a function as people would have implemented it now. I don't know. I haven't looked too closely at it. That's exciting. Let's see. Is there anything else that we should talk about that we've skipped over?
I mean, we haven't really talked about yeah. This is traditionally the part of one of these chats where we talk about our concrete plans for like getting this out in front of people, and we're not yet gonna commit to anything publicly, but I do want people watching this to know that we hear you when you say give us a beta that we can start playing with. It is our top priority at the moment. Everything that we're doing is geared towards getting something that we can put on npm and have people start using in their own apps instead of just in the playground. So bear with us, it is coming.
Exciting. All right. Yeah, I think that's it, unless you have anything to add. No?
I don't know. Are there any questions from the chat? I
Yeah,
don't know.
we could take some questions from the chat. Let's see here if we can.
I saw quite a few questions about transitions, given that we know something about that. So for Svelte 5, we're hoping to keep the vast majority, if not all of the sort of existing behavior working the same in Svelte, between Svelte 4 and 5. One of the cool things we've actually implemented is that we now use web animation API under the hood for non-tick based animations, so that should give you a slight performance improvement. It should also give the code is much simpler than it was before because it does a lot of the same things. So that should
also CSP support finally.
Yes. There's a few things we're also trying to figure out and work out because it's not a one-to-one change. Transitions have to be ported over to how signals and effects and how the new internals work. So we're still going through that, but so far so good. So I just wanted to call that one out.
Yep. No, it's sounds good. Free performance boost without doing anything is what it sounds like to me as a user, at least.
That's the plan.
Yeah. So there's a question here about it's not really runes related, but it's about TypeScript support inside of HTML templates. Is that going to be a thing?
Yeah, it's definitely a goal. Not for 5.0, but just because there's so much other stuff to do, but there will be HTML, TypeScript in HTML at some point, yes. One of the biggest blockers we have for that is actually the each block, because like the syntax is each items as item, and the as keyword is like it's conflicting with the TypeScript as keyword. And so if we're just going to pass the each block, then we like the TypeScript plugin wouldn't know, okay, is that now the as of Svelte or the as of TypeScript? And so it's probably not possible to pass the each block at least. And so maybe in the process of that, we also heard that some people find the each syntax a bit weird. So maybe we, in the process of that, will revisit that and maybe introduce, I don't know, some kind of like a for block or something, which basically has the same capabilities, but with a different syntax that is more similar to how the JavaScript for loop works, and also has TypeScript support in it, stuff like that. Yeah, so, but it's definitely on our radar.
Cool. I think that's a common complaint with users. Maybe we'll see a revised each block then. Interesting. Who knows? Yeah, another question about switch, like a switch case block.
We've danced around it a little bit. We haven't found a version of it that we really love, that like adheres to the conventions of blocks in all other cases, but also doesn't have this weird thing where the default case is at the top instead of at the bottom, and like how do you do fall through? And there's I don't know, it's weird. Most cases that we've looked at, it doesn't end up being less code than just using ifs. So yeah, I don't know, not ruling it out, but it's not an immediate goal.
Well, one thing we are actually considering, and I'm surprised it hasn't been brought up more, is error boundaries. This is something that's really important, especially in larger scale applications. You want to be able to capture errors that could occur fall back to some information and be able to recover from it. So that's definitely something that we're looking for. It won't be in 5.0, but it will be something that we're looking forward to in the future. And that's obviously something that we care about a lot too. And thankfully, the new architecture allows for that to happen. It would have been difficult to apply it to the old architecture, but the new one, it should be possible.
All right. I guess that's it with regards to questions. I'm not seeing any rune related ones. Let's see here. Internationalization, that's not runes. Interesting though. No. All right. Okay. So with that said, thanks for joining me. It was fun having you, the three of you on. We've just been doing one person before, so this was more. I guess this one was a bit more of a discussion format than what we've done before, because there's not all that much to show since the runes have already been shown. So, but yeah, I guess with that said, we will see all of the viewers next devlog, or next This Week in Svelte that we're doing every week, or at Svelte Summit next month. Don't miss it. It's going to be great. Lots of fun, exciting talks. I've seen them. So, yeah. With that said, bye everyone.